This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 136, Nerds. I am Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for checking in. I hope no one considers nerd to be a pejorative term. My guests this week certainly do not. Jared Bollman is the preacher for the Fifth Street Church of Christ in Beaverton, Oregon. The action figures in his office speak volumes. Jared Saltz is a professor at Florida College and preaches for the Palmetto Church of Christ in Tampa. There is no Star Wars film, TV show, or novel he's not consumed. We discuss our role as underdogs in our spiritual fight, the hyper-correctness of spelling bees, and the chess moves that show our world our true values. Let's start with what I've been preaching. Long before Michael Vick became a household name, men would gather in seedy, smoke-filled rooms and bet on dogfights. When one dog was pinned on its back, the other suddenly became almost certain to win. That changed the betting odds considerably, of course. You could make a huge profit by betting on the one almost certain to lose, hence our term, underdog. The Bible's full of underdog stories, characters who no one took seriously, but who became great success stories with God's help. What are your favorites and why? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
I guess a Jared should go first, right? I'll let you go, Jared.
Oh, well, thank you, Jared. The Bible is just absolutely filled with these underdog characters. And I was thinking about this question this morning, and I guess I'll choose everybody's favorite. It's got to be David. He's the underdog right from the very beginning as Samuel is evaluating the next to be anointed king after Saul has disappointed God so badly that Samuel's looking at all of his older brothers, and he's just absolutely convinced that this is the one that God is going to choose. And then ultimately, of course, it's David that gets chosen, and he's not the tall in stature, he's not the powerful, he's the little brother that nobody invited in that was out tending the sheep. And then, of course, the next big introduction that we have to David is the showdown with Goliath, where his faith speaks, even though he's being diminished in the sight of everybody by his brothers, and then ultimately can't even wear Saul's armor out into combat. But he is, I guess, in the eyes of other people, he's always the underdog up until the point that he becomes the king. Even when he's on or sits on the throne, even when he's on the run from Saul, he's constantly somebody that you would look at and say, okay, the whole world is against this guy. But yet he always comes out on top.
I knew somebody would go with David.
David's the easy choice, right? I'll go a little more niche for my choice, and that is my favorite underdog is Jael in the book of Judges. So in Judges chapters 4 and 5, we have multiple subversions of our expectations, right? So we're introduced to this guy named Barak, and his name is like thunder and lightning, this big, beefy, strapping guy, and we're just expecting him to be the hero of the story because God calls him to be. And then he says, no, I'm not going to go unless you bring this woman whose name is Deborah, which just means like this little bee, a woman who's supposed to be seen and not heard, busy about the house. I'm not going to go and be a big warrior unless she gets there. And God says, okay, well, you're not going to get the glory for this victory. It's going to go to a woman. And we're like, okay, we're ready for this. It's going to go to Deborah. But it doesn't. Instead, we are shifted still further away, farther even into underdog status. And as the battle is raging, we learn about the general who, gets on his chariot and runs as far as it goes, then gets on his feet and runs as far as it goes. And we're introduced to this woman of no account, of no special calling, not a prophetess, not a judge, no, just a woman. And a woman who is an ally, the wife of an ally of this General Sisera. And yet as he goes into her, and we would assume takes advantage of her, at least that's what Sisera's mom thinks he's doing at the time, she instead gets the better of him and unmans him and kills him and stabs him with his tent peg, and shows that she is indeed the one who has come out victorious. This woman of no account who we never know anything else about, who's not an Israelite, who is from every conceivable consideration of no account. and she's the one who gains the victory, and she's the one who takes out the greatest general of this people who have taken a combination of 5+ tribes to defeat.
Mm-hmm. Jail's another example also of, and Jared Saltz is deep diving into Judges. That's kind of his thing. He did a podcast a while back with Philip Martin about the warlords of Judges. And there's this thing, you see it with Shamgar killing people with an ox goad. Samson kills people with a jawbone of a donkey, which some people have suggested may be some kind of hand tool or a literal jawbone, either one, something he found, basically. The idea of just you're ready for the work and the tool presents itself. Jael kills Sisera with a tent peg. That's not a weapon, that's a tool, something she uses all the time to set up her tent. It's available, and she's able to turn that for God's purposes because she's of a mind to do that. And that's what God's warriors are always going to do. They find the circumstances in front of them. Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a tool, maybe it is money, whatever it happens to be. I'm in position to do something great here, and I'm able to do that. And the glory always goes to God. And Judges is a great book with regard to that. That there's so many of these underdog stories. We could talk about Gideon. We could talk about Jephthah. People who don't seem to have any kind of real expectation of success, but God gives them the success because in the right place, at the right time, with the right attitude. Okay, I need you guys to riff off of this a little bit more than that.
Well, let me pick another one.
Awesome that Jael is an underdog.
Well, let me pick another one that I think is kind of an underdog in the sort of an opposite way, and that is Paul. On the one hand, Paul doesn't seem like an underdog at all, right? Like he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's got all the status, all the glory, all the power, you want. He's the up and coming star. He's, sitting at the feet of this great rabbi, and then he leaves it all apart. And rather than so many of these heroes and underdog heroes of the Old Testament who kind of win this military victory, Paul wins his victory, as he says, in proving him being an underdog when he's talking in 2 Corinthians, where he says, hey, let me give you my victory status. I've been stoned this many times. I've been beaten this many times. I've been shipwrecked. I've been hungry. I've been thirsty. I've been tired. I've been exhausted. And no matter what the world throws at me, I am beaten down, but I'm not crushed. I am overturned, but I'm not destroyed. And the entire point of that, he says, is because Christ has strengthened me. And here, this underdog looks like, from the worldly perspective, that he is just losing over and over and over and over and over again. And yet what he really has gained is the greatest victory of all. And that from the world's perspective, it doesn't look like it. But
Right.
From an eternal perspective, we see that this underdog is actually the one who is far more powerful and victorious over anybody who would seek to take him out.
We might not count him as an underdog, but Abel kind of follows that same example that, here's the guy that's murdered by his brother, and that's the last we hear of him until Jesus drops his name there at the end of Matthew 23. But then in the Hebrew writer says, even though he's dead, his blood is still speaking. And he's listed right there as the first of the faithful in Hebrews 11 as being one who was diligently seeking God. And so, maybe we wouldn't think of that as a traditional underdog story, but it definitely is one that subverts the expectation, and sort of like Paul's did.
Absolutely. Do you think that we love these stories because they give us a sense of power? They give us a sense of possibility, because there's a tendency, and it may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, for us to underestimate our own abilities, for us to focus on our shortcomings. And surely I'm one person in 7 billion, or I'm one person in 100,000, or however many my culture happens to be. I can't do very much. I'm not very strong. I don't have very many allies. And then we see somebody like us, somebody that we can relate to, and they're able to do this thing. And I said, well, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could succeed. in this kind of area? I think that's part of it.
I think it is. I think hope is a big part of it. I mean, you think about a passage like, 1 Peter chapter 5, where it talks about, our adversary, the devil, walking about like a roaring lion, and he's looking for the one that he would devour. And yet we're told to resist him and that he'll flee from us. And the idea that you see in James 4 about the humility that the humble is the person that God exalts, and that when we cleanse our hands and purify our hearts, then God is drawing near to us as we're drawing near to him. I think that there's a heavenly perspective that we gain when we look at these underdog stories. Maybe one of the great underdogs in scripture is the church as it's presented in Revelation chapter 12, where it looks like it's about to be devoured by this dragon, or Jesus looks like he's about to be devoured by the dragon. But then you have the church coming out of that, and the persecution of the church, and how much victory imagery is given, but it in the book after that, but none of it has to do with the power of the church. It all has to do with the power of our Redeemer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times we can kind of tend to fall into two kind of very disparate camps. And on the one hand, it's like we like underdogs, right? Whatever the story is, if there's someone who's like the plucky rebel, that's who we like, right? Regardless of anything else, right? Morality or anything else. I mean, if you are watching college football and someone's playing Alabama, anybody who's not an Alabama fan is rooting for that team, right? It's like the Patriots back in the day. Everybody rooted against the Patriots. They just like this underdog story. But on the other hand, then there's the group of people who just want to be a bandwagoner, right? Like they want to join themselves with these people who are powerful. And so you've got these kind of two competing desires for ourselves. And I think we have to be careful of either one, because on the one hand, we can diminish ourselves so much to say, oh, well, because I'm such an underdog, I really shouldn't accomplish anything. It's like, okay, yes, but also no, because in all those underdog stories that we picked, whether it's David or whether it's JL or whether it's Paul or anybody else, it's not exactly an underdog story when you realize that God is on our side. Right. And as much of an underdog as David was to Goliath, Goliath is far more of an underdog when it comes to Goliath versus God. And so we have to be careful that we don't use that to kind of expunge ourselves from any responsibility. And yet on the same time, I do think these speak to us. And I do think that it's really important for us when we're studying the Bible to not just kind of make kind of these pristine, perfect heroes out of people in the Bible who often aren't. Because once we realize that, to pick on the group of people that I tend to think about a lot, the judges, once you realize that they're pretty terrible people, a lot of them, and God still uses them to accomplish his purpose, then we realize we don't actually have an excuse. That God can and will and should use us if we go along with him. And so kind of those two things pulling at us in slightly different ways, I think are pretty interesting for us to consider as Christians.
It's odd.
It is. Sorry about that.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, it is easy to discount. You look at it and you go, well, I'm no Paul. Well, even Paul said, I'm not an eloquent man. That we say, well, I'm no Peter. Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we see their shortcomings. There's a reason why we have the story about Noah and his drunkenness after they come out of the ark. It's because you don't want paragons of faith that seem like you can't attain, or you can't become, or you can't follow in their footsteps. And Abraham is the father of the faithful, and yet you have so many of the stories that we know about him where the emphasis is not his faith in God, but rather points where his faith waned and wasn't as sharp as it should be. And I've often said that if all we knew about David was the historical account after he sat upon the throne, there's not really a whole lot of good stories about him after he sits on the throne. If it wasn't for his younger years in the Psalms, then we wouldn't see a man after God's own heart. And I think it's important that we realize that, so that we don't excuse ourselves from the work, and that we don't lose sight of the hope that is not ours because of our strength, but because of his strength.
Absolutely. I was just thinking about the Bible is full, as we already mentioned, of underdog stories, and in a very real sense, the entire nation of Israel, the entire plan of God, is the ultimate underdog story. This little bitty nation, this fly speck on the map, God's going to turn this into some great thing. Even after multiple failures, after they fumble the ball over and over and over again, God's still with them. God's still carrying them through all of these things, and his people reflect that. It's no wonder that we get the jail stories, the Esther stories, the stories of that sort. And I was thinking, if there are two exceptions to this rule, if there are two people who come on the scene who look like they actually have the world by the tail, they actually would be tremendous success stories from day one, the superheroes of the Bible would be Samson and Solomon. People who come in on day one. There's no reason why this person shouldn't succeed. And we really classify them, and they had tremendous successes, both of them, but we really define them by their failures more than their successes. God is able to accomplish things through them despite their weaknesses, and sometimes even because of their weaknesses. God is able to use these weak people who appear to be strong to teach us that the things that we are used to looking at as being defining characteristics with regard to greatness, with regard to possibility, potential, God doesn't look at us that way. And we need to get over that idea of, well, he's bigger and stronger. He was born for greatness. Who was more destined for greatness than Samson was? Before he was ever born, he was going to be great. He couldn't help it. He was going to be great regardless of what he did. And he still finds a way to mess it up, because that's what we do, unfortunately, when we lose that humility that I was going to say that Jared was talking about. I'm going to have to break myself. I need to not say that, I suppose, because that doesn't narrow it down much. But
I'm Jared and he's Jared, so I mean, that helps.
I mean, you're right, exactly, about Jared saying it. So
exactly,
absolutely.
But if we could just break ourselves of this attraction to superheroes and find greatness in individual people, in everyday activity, in simple, humble service, I think we'd go a long way toward finding those kind of stories in our own lives.
Now, Hal, you should have known this was going to happen when you invited two guys that do podcasts on here. Do you think that our attraction to superheroes comes because we aspire to greatness, or do you think it comes because we feel like we're lacking in the strength that they have? That
I tend to think the latter. I think that we see in the heroes that we want the things that we cannot have, and I think that's especially the case with heroes like Batman or whatever, who don't appear to have anything going for them except just a whole lot of opportunity.
And
they're
money.
able, and money. Yes, well, that's a different word for opportunity. He's able to bend the rules. He's able to get the job done. That's how I would like to be. I would like to be fixing people's problems. I would like to be changing the world. And what a shame that the system is kind of rigged against us. We mean well. We want to do the right thing. And so often we convince ourselves that the right thing is doing some great thing, some huge thing. And the Bible has those stories. No question about that. But in a lot of ways, the great heroic stories of the Bible are when little people do little things. Esther's willing to look her husband in the face without being invited. David picks up a rock and throws it at a giant. There are little things that little people do that make a difference.
Well, and I think ultimately that goes back to that thought that it's not the heroic or the power that gives the individual that gives the increase, but it's God that gives the increase, and that he uses those small things. And And it makes passages like Ephesians chapter 4, or Paul's words to the Corinthians about the body and how God has assembled it as just as he wants it. It makes that make a lot more sense, that we all have heroes of faith that are men of our generation. A lot of those are passing away recently, that we think of, if I could just preach like so and so. Well, you preach the best that you can. You do the best that you can in the field that you're at, and you do it to God's glory. And he'll use that to his advantage. And whether or not I'm ever anybody's hero, that's inconsequential. What's consequential, or the main focus is am I glorifying God? And that should always be my focus. And I think that's what all of these heroes that are the small people that do the great things, that they all have, or at least for the most part, in common. I mean, what was it that Mordecai told Esther, that who knows whether or not this is the hour that you've been appointed for, but God's going to deliver his people. And so we need to have that thought that I'm part of the plan of God in some way. And if I'm honoring him, then I'm going to be serving his ends, even if I don't see it as something that's great.
Yeah, there's a person I follow, and I think he put this really well, talking about these small things. And his name's Matt Emerson, and he said, some men find true masculinity pursuing holiness, caring well for their family, even at the expense of their own dreams and desires, working hard, usually in obscurity, leading their church and home. Some men find this true masculinity so boring that they have to invent controversies in order they can pretend to be warriors. And I think that's the real danger of a kind of a superhero or underdog or whatever mentality that you want, is that we think that, oh, I was made for great things. And we don't realize that these small things are great things. They're the great things, right? It's not these major battles or anything else, because otherwise then we don't really believe Jesus is the greatest. That if he is truly the greatest hero, then we have to emulate his life. And what we see is he teaches, and this is something I tell my students all the time, whoever is faithful in little will be faithful in much. Get the small things right. Pursue these small victories. And that's the most important thing any of us can work on, any of us can do.
I was just thinking of Micah 6:6-8. A lot of us would rather offer 10,000 rivers of oil, because that makes me look impressive. Not everybody can do that. If I could put myself in a position to offer thousands of animals, well, they'll be talking about that forever. We're still talking about all the sacrifices that Solomon made. What a great guy he must have been. To do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with your God, it takes a special kind of person to do that. It doesn't take a remarkable person as far as capacity goes, talents go, but it takes a special character. There's a large percentage, an overwhelming percentage of people who simply cannot do that, or at least can't bring themselves to do that. But the average Christian, if he puts his mind to it, if he puts his faith in God, he can do those things. It's not necessarily going to make you, a star. It won't get your name on a building someplace, most likely. But it'll get your name in the book of life. And ultimately, isn't that what we're going for?
Well, isn't that the same thing that Naaman's servant told him when he was leaving in a huff? That, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So what's the problem with going and washing in the Jordan River? And I think sometimes we forget that when it is the power of God that we're talking about, that there are no small things, and that he, and you pointed this out earlier, he used Esther being able to turn her face to her husband at a time when she wasn't bidden to do so, and he used a rock. And we do despise the day of small things, and we do despise the remnant, because we don't like, even as much as we like the underdog stories, we like the underdogs that come out on top. We I don't know that the movie Rocky could be made today and have it be a real success, where the guy doesn't. If you haven't seen this yet,
Spoiler alert.
I feel like you've had over 40 years, but he doesn't win. I mean, he doesn't come out on top, and
he
maybe
beats Drago in 4.
Yeah, he does beat Drago in 4, but nobody likes that movie. But
the nerds
we
like
want our underdogs to be secretly the most powerful. I mean, Superman is never the underdog, but Clark Kent is, and we all want to believe that we're Clark Kent harboring Superman inside, and we want to do the great things, but the great things are made up of little things. And I mean, you look at how many congregations have started in this country because somebody realized that there wasn't truth being taught, and it started with 1 or 2 families getting together in a home and with a dedication of, we're going to teach the truth, and we're going to have a congregation of God's people where that's done. And it grew and grew and grew, and it may have grown into a congregation that's several hundred people after decades, but it started with one person's commitment to the truth.
This is what I've been reading. Surely the nerdiest of all competitions is the spelling bee. While most dismiss it as pointless and boring, the participants absolutely immerse themselves in it. In his book, American Bee, James McGuire delves into the lives of bee participants and their families, the nature of the English language, and how greatness in spelling translates to greatness in life. As a bit of an amateur lexicographer myself, I appreciate the passion for doing things the right way, including in areas when many will even deny there is a right way. But is precise accuracy always necessary? And can the quest for correctness actually become a problem?
I'll let Jared start this one.
Oh, no. You let me start the last one. I'm going to let Jared start this one.
Okay, so this is one of the many areas of my nerdiness. I pursued multiple advanced degrees, including in a lot of languages, not just Biblical Hebrew or Greek, but in languages like a lot of people haven't heard of, like Neo-Babylonian or Akkadian or things of that nature. And so the English language, in spite of all this is what the whole setup is for this, is actually not to brag at all, but to say, I cannot spell. I will rewrite entire sentences because I can't get a word close enough for spell check to find it at times.
It's called Grammarly.
It doesn't help. It doesn't help sometimes, right?
It makes me look 10 times better as a writer.
There you go. So when we have these questions about correctness and things, I can get all my high arse like, well, there wasn't even a standardization of spelling prior to the printed word, and this is all like, we are at the tyranny of the printing press. Okay, Gutenberg has destroyed you and all of your minds about what correct spelling is. But that would maybe reveal a little too much of my nerdiness.
That's why you can't spell phonics phonetically.
Exactly. But all that to say, I do think that there is such a thing as demanding too much precision on something, whether that's in our lives or something else. There's a saying, maxim that says the perfect is the enemy of the good. And sometimes we can get so caught up in something being perfect and just let every little mistake debilitate us that we can't move forward or progress. There are some people who say, well, I'm going to go work out, but it's not going to be a perfect workout. I tweaked my thumb 3 weeks ago, or I didn't have a perfect meal, or I better just not go because it's not going to be the perfect thing. But so often in our lives, as we just talked about, we're not going to be perfect. But that doesn't mean we don't try, and that doesn't mean we don't offer what we have, and that doesn't mean we don't pursue holiness and pursue perfection, but not using that as an excuse to debilitate us or to diminish us or to keep us from doing something. But we go and we do the best that we can, and recognizing that God will perfect and complete our faith and make up for what is lacking in us.
And that was beautiful. And I really appreciate you saying exactly what you said there, because I think there's a pendulum that we get caught in, particularly among the church, where we swing from this, where we're talking about perfection to the degree that we're almost talking about justification by works if we're not very careful. And then it'll swing back the other way, and it sounds like we're faith only or grace only. And what we don't realize is that, I mean, we hopefully realize it, but what maybe the average person doesn't realize is that there is no grace without obedience, because obedience is the answer to the call of grace and things like that. So I need to not give myself a pass when I see myself lacking, but at the same time, I need to understand that I'm never not in need, because I'm never going to be that perfect. And the trap of perfection is exactly what the Pharisees fell into. I mean, Jesus talks about in Matthew 23 when he says they pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin, but they neglect the weightier matters of the law. That perfection and feeling like I can be perfect is a very dangerous trap to fall into. Yet just about every day I'll wake up and somebody's written an article about some imperfection that they see about in some denominational preacher somewhere in their life, but they don't talk about their own need for grace and their own need for a deeper trust in exactly what Paul said to the Thessalonians, that it's God that perfects, it's God that sanctifies, that if we don't keep that in mind, then we end up becoming exactly what Paul was warning about in Romans 3 and 4 as those who trust. In fact, Matt Bassford wrote a brilliant article on this today, who put their trust in our ability to perfectly keep God's word, as opposed to realizing that we are never not in need of his grace. And I think First John talks about that the one who says that he has no sin is deceiving himself, that we're never not in need of Jesus's advocacy. We don't want that to swing so far that we feel like, oh, God's got this. I don't really have to focus on morality or godliness. And Jared was not saying that at all, but you also don't want to feel like you're the one doing the heavy lifting spiritually.
Yeah. I think when you go through and look at the Gospels in particular, you see two things that at first seem diametrically opposed. And the first is that no matter where you are, Jesus accepts you as you are, right? Like the woman at the well, hey, you've got 18 bajillion husbands, and the guy you're shacking up with now isn't even your husband, right? Jesus still says, come to me, right? Whether you're that person or you're, the rich young ruler who thinks he's got it all figured out, he accepts you wherever you are. But no matter where you are when you come to him, he demands that you change and transform yourself to become more like him. And so he accepts everybody, but he demands that every single one of us change. And we often think, oh, well, that Pharisee almost had it figured out, the rich young ruler, he was so much closer. But it's a question of scale, because when we realize how far even the most perfect one of us is far from the holiness of God, then we realize that they're much closer together than any of us will ever be to God. And so we all have that same necessary transformation and journey. And it's not like, oh, well, Hal is so much worse than I am. I'm really doing well. I'm like right there beside Jesus. No, like there's no difference between us, don't know why I'm throwing Hal or those, the two Jareds or something. When we consider and compare ourselves to Jesus, which is why too often we don't compare ourselves to Jesus. We compare ourselves to like the worst person we find. We're like, hey, I look pretty good when you compare myself to Hitler. And you're like, that, okay, good job.
He's everybody's straw man.
Exactly. Right. Hitler
and slave owners.
Yeah, they're kind of grouped there together.
That's right. They're the ones we know are going to be in hell. We sang the hymn, He Leadeth Me, I think last Sunday. And I noticed a change in my attitude toward perfection, because not to speak ill of the dead, but the version of our hymnal that R.J. Stevens had put together includes on the last stanza, when by God's grace the victory's won, instead of when by thy grace. And you read the entire verse and you realize that is grammatically accurate, whereas the other was not grammatically accurate. It's consistent. It's who you're addressing in all of this. We're not addressing God, we're addressing one another. And so therefore it's God's grace rather than thy grace. And 20 years ago, I would have been standing in my pew and applauding this change. It was wrong before, it's right now. What could be wrong with this? And now, as a 55-year-old, I look at this and say, you know what? I really think we're missing the point here. I think that we have jumped the shark with regard to correctness on these kind of things. We knew exactly what the hymn was saying before. We didn't need to be precise about that. So we'll rob the verse of its poetry, of its history and such, just to cross a T that wasn't crossed before. I had an elder in the church insist that Psalm 51 is teaching that David's mother was not married to his father, because the text says there that when he was born in my sin, it says, in sin my mother conceived me. And that the antecedent of the word connects to this, that, and the other. He literally diagrammed the sentence for me to prove that this is talking about his mother's sin, when every other verse in the psalm is talking about David's sin.
Mm-hmm.
Does God have to apply?
I heard that one.
Does God need to apply my sense of grammatical correctness to be effectively communicating with his people? We know what this psalm is talking about. Sometimes truth is evident, and we can complicate things by digging into the precision of this, that, and the other. I don't want to diminish the importance of being right in the slightest, because being right is very important. But I found out, after far too long in marriage, should have gotten it right away. It took me longer than it should have, that being good is a lot better than being right. And it took probably 10 years of marriage for me to figure that out. I would much rather be a good person than being a correct person. And there are a lot of Pharisees running around the church today who are very proud of being right, and very well may be right, at least in that specific context, but don't have the Spirit of God in them at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really clear when you look at how Paul talks to the Galatians, right? And it's not that you're just being right. You have to be right in the right way. You can be right in the wrong way, and then all of a sudden you're no longer right. I mean, Paul to the Corinthians says, hey, listen, knowledge puffs up. Now, is knowledge a bad thing? No. But if you do this in the wrong way, or if you have the wrong spirit of you're self-serving, it's like the Pharisees that Jesus says, hey, look, if you're praying on the street corners, you've got your reward. It's not that they're wrong. It's that they're not doing it in the right way. And these are dual requirements for us, is not just doing the right thing or thinking the right thing, but doing it in the right way. Too many people have thought of contending for the faith means being contentious for the faith, right? Too many people have taken, and Hal may want to cut this one if this is too much on the nose, but if you think about the old argument, right? Like someone said, oh, where do you go to church? Oh, this is my church. And they're like, you didn't die for that church. It's like, and you don't complain when I say that's my bank either. We all know what we're talking about. You're like, oh, that's my Mexican restaurant. Oh, do you own them? Like, no one thinks that. But so often
nobody criticizes me when I say my Astros are going to the World Series.
Do you own those Astros? I mean, they might.
I've never played first base for them,
right?
No. I mean, the year that we allegedly cheated, we beat the Dodgers in their own stadium. So I mean, it's just.
I would suggest you that Red Sox fans probably would criticize you, but that's a different story.
Yeah, they can criticize all they want. They're watching from sidelines.
But we have to be careful, I do think, and by we, I don't mean just other people. I mean me here, because man, I like being right. I do a lot. But to try to rein some of that in, and realizing that sometimes winning the battle may lose the war, and that what this argument, if I'm in an argument, should be about is not primarily about who is right, but what is right, and more importantly about a soul. And sometimes it's better to step back and just say, Okay. Not because we're compromising truth, not because we say truth doesn't matter, but because acting the way Jesus has told us to act is also a requirement of truth, and one that we definitely can actually make certain that we hold on to ourselves.
Well, and I think one of the things that we're in danger of when we talk about wanting to be right, and I know I saw this myself when I was younger and I was preaching and holding down a full-time job. The idea of I'm doing more than the other person sort of puffs you up a little bit. Not a little bit, it puffs you up a lot. It's just like
not sort of.
Jared was talking about knowledge and what Paul said in 1 Corinthians. The emphasis should never be on is what I'm doing right. It's is what I'm doing treating God as holy. I mean, when you look at Leviticus chapter 10, and you have the story of Nadab and Abihu, that what was the rebuke? It wasn't that they didn't offer the right fire at the right time. God says, or Aaron realized that this is exactly what God had said, and Moses even says it, that by those who come near me, I'll be treated as holy. And it's the same rebuke in Numbers chapter 20, when they strike the rock and they're supposed to speak to the rock. And what does God tell Moses there? He says, because you didn't believe me to honor me before the people and treat me as holy. That the sin of Moses there wasn't that he struck the rock when God told him to speak to it. That was a symptom of something else. The sin was, in that moment, he was not thinking about God's holiness and presenting God as holy. And if he had, he would have never struck the rock. And when it's about, hey, I pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin, or I'm like the Pharisee in my prayer, I thank God that I'm not like this publican and other men that are like him. When I can take comfort in my own rightness, then what I lose sight of is that it is only by God's grace, by thy grace, but not yours. But
Right.
the idea there that we have a connection to a deeper grace that allows me to profess God's holiness. I once had a woman tell me one time, and I won't say what congregation this was part of, but we aren't the people that believe in the grace of God. And that just absolutely floored me. This person wouldn't sing the song Amazing Grace, that to her, grace and baptism were so far separated in her mind, because we had beat this drum of you're saved at baptism, and correctly so. I mean, that's true. That's the point of the forgiveness of sins, according to 1 Peter 3 and Romans chapter 6 and Matthew 28. But the Acts 2, but when you disconnect that from the fact that this is part of a plan that the God of heaven put together, and I'm just being allowed to participate in it, then I become the one, and I become the focus, as opposed to it being God is the focus and Jesus is the focus and their holiness is the focus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we need to embrace the fact that we will take a participation trophy here, right? Like, we're riding the pine the whole series, but you know what? We get a ring just like everybody else. And honestly, that's kind of how it is, right? We're not contributing anything to God. He doesn't need us. He's going to do his thing, and we're along for the ride. When you read Paul's description of the Roman triumph there in 2 Corinthians, we often can get our ideas that we're like the victorious soldiers. We're helping Jesus win. He may be the emperor, right? He may be the conqueror, but we're the victorious soldiers. Then you read a little closer, like, no, oh, we're the rebellious slaves whom he's captured. Like, right. That's who we are. And that shifts your thought process just a little bit on that.
We're victorious because we got defeated by the right person.
Yeah.
So we almost accidentally were on the right side. Circling back to the idea of the spelling bee, I was just thinking about how strange it is, in my mind anyway, that someone could receive $10,000, $20,000 worth of scholarship money or whatever, simply because they could spell words well. That seems odd to me. And the only way I can rationalize it in my mind is that people will assume that if you are willing to pursue greatness in this small little niche area to that extreme, you are that focused on being as good as you possibly can be, that speaks to your character, that you're willing to take that kind of that work ethic and apply it in other areas. Nobody's ever going to get rich spelling words. Ken Jennings didn't even get rich spelling words. That's not reasonable. But if you can have that same kind of passion about accuracy, not just in doctrinal areas, but in moral areas, in service areas, in areas of humility, studying your word, if studying God's word, that is, if we can have that same passion for being correct in this kind of thing, whether it's baptism or grace or anything else, then we're setting ourselves up with a work ethic that will serve us well in all kinds of other areas and put us in submission to God in every aspect of our life. Or we can become haughty and arrogant and say, I'm the best speller that anybody's ever heard of. You've never met anybody better speller than me. And what are you going to do with that other than brag for the rest of your life?
Then to those people, you'll say, and you're the greatest speller that no one's ever heard of comparatively, right? Like,
right.
What have you, it's like Paul, after all of his bragging, says, yeah, and I just considered this a outhouse full of garbage, because that's really what it is, and that's all of our accomplishments are not that impressive.
I mean, we all have that tendency to I'll pull out my nerd card again. We all have that tendency to swerve into the Uncle Rico mentality of I
can
remember
throw this here.
I wasn't cool. That I could throw the football over the mountain if you just gave me enough time, kind of thing. And it's interesting to me how this thought gets peppered throughout Scripture. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking there, how about the parable of talents, that what did you think about that talent is 75 to 100 pounds of precious metal. I mean, that's a lot. If you translated that to gold, that's a lot of worth. The 1 talent man had been entrusted with a lot, but the 5 talent man and the 2 talent man, they don't seem to ever distinguish themselves in any kind of way, except for the fact that they met the expectation of what was put on them. It's not that they were super shrewd. It's not that they were just better than the 1 talent man. It's just that they went and did with what they were given to do. And that's, I think, the takeaway from this. And it goes back to your spelling bee, that it speaks to the character and the greatness that we can achieve is not personal glory. That the greatest thing I hope I ever achieve is helping my son get to heaven. I mean, that's the thing that I'm most concerned about, is building a little person that will follow hopefully in the good footsteps that I'm putting in front of him to build his own faith. And that to me will be greatness. And that to me will be still only by the grace of God doing exactly what was expected of me with what I was entrusted with, because at the end of the day, I'm still just an unprofitable servant.
This is what I've been playing. When you think of nerds, likely you think of chess. Rightly or wrongly, it's considered the game of intellectuals. It requires depth of thought, tunnel vision, and a ruthless desire to win at any cost within the rules. Sacrificing the occasional pawn or even a queen is an easy decision if it is the difference between winning and losing. We as Christians are all about claiming the prize at the end. We too must make sacrifices, pastimes, money, even relationships, and we're glad to do it. Does that make us cold or robotic? Is it possible to balance big picture thinking and emotional connection?
You do have to go first this time, Jared, because I went first last time.
See, this is why you need four segments. But I would say it doesn't make us cold or robotic. I mean, I guess you can go about it in a cold, robotic way, but I mean, Paul in Philippians 3, which is my absolute favorite passage of Scripture, there's just nothing cold or robotic about that. That he is very passionate for gaining Christ. He says, I am pressing. That it's not about facts and figures or numbers. It's not about, hey, I weighed the potential outcomes. he sees something in Jesus and he wants to lay hold of that. And it's the greater passion. Sorry if that wasn't enough of a lead in, Jared.
Oh, no, it's pretty good. Although I would disagree. Philippians 2 is a better passage than Philippians 3, but I'll allow it. I'll allow it. But a lot of times we'll read the description about laying aside every encumbrance and have this idea about running a race with endurance. And we think, we're going to run faster, right? Like it's this passion, we're going to run faster, get rid of all this extra stuff. It's like when you go hiking, and you say, ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain. You try to shave down this whole thing. And I think sometimes we get the wrong idea that this is as though like it's a preparation thing, where in reality, we're like that person at the end of the race who wants to keep all this stuff with us, right? Like, and yet we realize slowly as we strip off thing after thing after thing, just to lighten the load a little bit, that we have to get rid of it all if we're going to make it to the goal. And those are very, very different personas. And sometimes we can be the first. We realize, I got to get this out of my life. And I don't want it anymore, and I don't like it. We're happy to lay it aside. But sometimes it has to be stripped from us from God. Going back to Samson, who we talked about in the first segment. When does Samson pray to God? It is not until everything has been stripped from him. It's not until his eyes have been taken, his hair has been shorn, he's been mutilated, he's been tortured, he's been humiliated. Like, that's what it took to get him to have any sort of faith whatsoever. And it's not that he was cold or robotic. In fact, it's this tenderizing process that allows him to do that. And all too often I find that in myself, that rather than just being so glad to lay aside these things that entangle me, they have to kind of be stripped away. Because rather than being cold and robotic and logical, like I'm going to sacrifice this pawn because I'm going to get in this goal, I'm like a new chess player. It's like, I don't want to get rid of my queen. Right? I don't want to. I like my knight more than the bishop because it's cool and it goes this way. And I don't care about the board positioning. This is the thing I like. But sometimes it's that player has an easier time playing after they get that piece taken away. And at least for myself, that unfortunately, I'd like to be that cool, calculating person, but too often I'm the person who needs things stripped away for me to realize they were entangling me. They were not helping me. They were weighing me down. And now I realize that if I want to get across that finish line, I've just got to shed all this stuff that I thought was so important and so fancy and so exciting. It's like that person who jumps off the ship, in the story, and they've got like all their clothes and all their money and all their stuff. And then they realize that they're either going to keep it and they're going to drown, or they're finally going to get rid of it. Well, they didn't decide, I don't need any of this stuff. They decided they wanted to make it. And that sometimes is how I see myself.
Well, I don't think Paul came to the position that he came to in Philippians 2 or Philippians 3 until, obviously until the Damascus Road moment where he, lost his sight, that he was the person that, and he talks about it in Philippians 3, thought he had it all figured out. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was, zealous for persecuting the church. He had all the right answers, and yet Jesus still told him, isn't it hard for you to kick against the goads? That doesn't it hurt? Don't you realize that when you juxtapose what you're doing versus what you know about what God was going to do, you realize that the position that you're in is not an enviable one. And I think that's why, and you alluded to Hebrews 12 earlier, I think that's one of the reasons why you have that statement right after, laying aside the sin and the weight that encumbers us and run with endurance the race set before us. The very next phrase in Hebrews 12 is looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And then it shows us what his laying aside of the weight was. It says that for the joy set before him, he
despised the shame,
endured the cross, despising the shame. And anytime that I preach on that verse, I try to explain that to people. It's not saying he endured the shame of the cross. It's he literally looked at the cross and said, I'll go through you to get to what's on the other side. That it's not emphasizing the shame of the cross. It's emphasizing the fact that that Jesus looked at that as an encumbrance that he was going to go through and set aside, and because what was on the other side was worth more. So I think it's both sides. And I think Jared did a wonderful job of emphasizing the fact that sometimes it does have to be stripped away from us, like it was with Paul, or like it was with Samson, or even David at times, where it was stripped away from him. You think about when he was humbled after the census, or when Absalom took his concubines and slept with them in front of everybody, that David was really adjusted down a peg when that happened, because you have a person who needed to see that he wasn't where he should have been.
Now, I'll, as someone whose podcast title is taken from Philippians 3:20, I'm going to have to side with Jared Bollman on this officially.
Sinners.
breaking the tie. But to the idea of finding the joy at the end instead of finding the joy in the middle, I think that's a really important point. It's not that we are dismissive of the emotional state that we're in the short term. Paul's another example of this. In Romans, he talks about how distraught he is over his brethren in the flesh, that he give up his own soul, which I think is probably an exaggeration there, for to save them. His heart breaks for them. It's an emotional situation. It's just not a behavior defining situation. I don't go in a particular place because that's where my joy is. I'm going to heaven because that's where my joy is. And that sets us up for a great deal of sorrow. I mean, how many times do we have Jesus bemoaning his situation in life, and more to the point, really, the situation of his fellows, of his nation, how bad things are going to be, and they're going to get worse in the very near future. This is a disturbing thing. But acknowledging that sorrow doesn't mean that we're going to change our mind about this. So we've made a bad decision about this. We're not going to allow our emotional state to take us off track. It's, I like playing with the queen as much as anybody else does. And the idea of sacrificing a queen to win a game just hurts me in the heart, but you're going to do it. You're not going to shy away from that kind of thing. And if a relationship that I have is interfering with my walk with Christ, I'm better off without the relationship. Jesus is frankly kind of cold, or at least comes across kind of cold when his family comes to see him, and he says, I'm not interested in that right now. I'm interested in being with the people who I share a spiritual bond with, which is pretty much a slap in the face to his mother, who, as far as we can tell anyway, shares a faith, understands who he is supporting him in his work. But I'm going to reject that kind of relationship because I have more important things. That does not sound good. That is hurtful to a lot of people, and we don't rejoice in that. But at the same time, can we shy away from situations that make us unhappy, situations that disappoint us?
I think a lot about, or sorry, go ahead, Jared.
I was going to say, we appreciate it. We know he used that analogy in Matthew 5 and again in Matthew 18 about, cut off the eye, pluck out the eye, cut off the hand. That's harsh language. I mean, there's no denying that is calculating language, but it's also language of passion that speaks to not just I'm trying to achieve a certain preconceived calculated outcome, but I'm going to sacrifice everything to lay hold of that. And maybe, as you were alluding to, Hal, maybe it does to the outsider make us look a little robotic, that these people will give up anything, that they'll give up friends, they'll give up family, they'll give up, but it's not really calculating and taking and denying so much as it is looking at this and realizing these are things that are keeping me from God. and that's the most important relationship that I can have. And if you need any proof that Jesus still loved his mother, I mean, what did he do on the cross? That he charged one of his disciples with watching over her and with caring for her, making sure that she was taken care of, that he was concerned for her. And you can't take that one moment and just say, oh, well, he didn't care about his mother at all, which that's not what you were doing. But it's sometimes I think we emphasize those moments and we say that, okay, well, this is a cold moment, or this is calculating, or this is hurtful, but we forget about this is part of my journey from being someone who is self-willed to having a will that bends towards God.
I think, you mentioned Jesus' comment about, if your right hand causes you to sin, and cut it off. It makes me think a lot about the metaphor that Paul uses of sin in 2 Timothy chapter 2, when he says that sin is like gangrene. And, this is one of these things that we don't tend to think about very much today, unless you watch Civil War movies or something like that. But gangrene, infects a limb, and you've got two choices with their medicine at that time. You either chop the limb off, or you wait a little while and you die. And sin is like that when it entangles us. So we have to cut things off sometimes. But you can think about, kind of in this metaphor, the bedside manner of a doctor, right? On the one hand, he comes to you and says, oh, Jared, Michael, Hal, sorry about this, but everything's fine. That hand, it'll get better. I just want you to have your life's, comforting days. I'm not going to tell you what's going wrong with this. We'll just let you die, because I don't want you to feel sad about losing your hand. And that wouldn't be a very good doctor. But on the other hand, a very bad doctor would be like, okay, boy, oh boy, Jared, I'm so excited. I've got this new saw and I have been wanting to try it out. You know what? We're not just going to take the hand, Jared. I'm going to go for the arm. We're going to take it a few different cuts at a time, because I'm just so, I'm preaching harsh love to you, right? And you realize that neither of those is the right approach. What we need to do, whether it's for ourselves or especially for other people, is recognize that if we're asking people to cut off something that's sinful, that's entangled, that's actually probably pretty important to them, we need to recognize what that costs. Absolutely. And we need to be sad about what that costs, not gleeful about it, not excited, not that, look, we're get to prove we're, but at the same time, we also can't just pretend nothing's wrong and let them die. That you got to find somewhere in between that. And too often we can err to one side or the other, because that frankly probably fits our personality or our vision of ourselves too much. And that's something we got to be careful of. That's something I have to be careful of.
I don't remember who said it, but I heard someone once say, I wish I could be as dispassionate about my own sin as I am about other people's. And that to me is exactly what you just said. I mean, I had a reputation when I was younger of being a real fire and brimstone preacher, just because it's not what I grew up with, but it's just what you felt like was needed. And I realized that one of the reasons why I was constantly falling into that mold was I was consuming a lot of talk radio. I mean, just a lot of right-wing talk radio. And I'm still a very conservative person, but over a decade ago, in fact, I just did a biblically speaking on this, not to plug my own show, Hal, but I did one just a couple of weeks ago on my journey from conservatism to Christ-like, because it's not that I've relinquished my conservative values, but I realized that there was poison in the well that I was drawing from, and it was causing me to see the people that I'm supposed to love, that are my brethren, and the people I'm supposed to be to represent the call of the gospel to out in the world, to see them first as political creatures, as opposed to people who are either in need and they've never heard of the grace of God, or need to have the gospel reaffirmed to them on a regular basis so that they can make difficult choices. But what they need from me is a loving call that you can do this, you can make this hard decision. And I turned it off and never turned it back on, because there's poison in that well. And I had to be very, very define. I mean, that's a defining moment for me. I had to be very emphatic about that. Just, I'm not going to do this anymore. And it was like cutting off my hand or plucking out my eye, because that was, people knew me as being the guy that could tell them how every Republican and every Democrat, not every, but most of them voted on any particular issue when it came up. And I had to stop caring about that. But before I could stop caring about that, I had to turn it off and not make it part of me anymore.
The cynic in me would say at this point, this is what happens when a Texas boy moves to Oregon. He gets all spongy about these kind of things. But in truth,
that happened while I was still in Texas.
Yeah. In truth, Jared's is absolutely right, and I quit doing talk radio for similar reasons. It's it gets to be such a burden for us to carry this kind of emotional baggage, to be the one who is the fire and brimstone kind of guy. I've mentioned before in other contexts, when preachers tell me that their favorite character in the Bible is Elijah, I get nervous. I like Elijah as much as the next person. I wouldn't speak ill of Elijah, but Elijah, I think, is used as emotional justification by a lot of people. Look how rude Elijah was. Look how unemotional he was. He just stands in the face of evil and calls it evil and just shouts them down and as obnoxious as he possibly can. He's not worried about tone of voice. He's not worried about, okay, and Elijah will give account for his behavior just like all the rest of us are. That doesn't mean the Bible passages that talk about loving your neighbor as yourself and loving your enemies and praying for those who despitefully use you, they didn't disappear from the Bible just because we have a Bible character that's not painted in those terms.
Well, and even that reading of Elijah has to stop at 1 Kings 18 and never proceeds to 1 Kings 19.
Right.
Like that, the exact opposite of what we see in 1 Kings 19. And that's really where he wins the victory, not in 1 Kings 18. So I just taught this in class. So, I've got it kind of on my mind. But yeah, it's
1 Kings 18 is a great story. I mean, it's important that we take a strong stand for truth, but you have to remember that strong stand for truth was Elijah preaching a lot of sermons leading up to that were trying to turn people to truth. I mean, how long had the drought been going, or the famine been going on, and the rains hadn't fell? I think it was 3 years at that point. That I mean, we're ready to flare up like a signal flare at the drop of a hat, and that's not Elijah. And I would rather be an imitator of Jesus, not that Elijah wasn't Christ-like, but he says, "Come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, and take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls." And what does he tell them? My burden is easy, or my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Mm-hmm. That I think sometimes we demand perfection of other people that we don't demand of ourselves, kind of going back to our first topic. Mm-hmm. But we demand, I don't know what, you may move the order around so that may be another topic, but we demand a perfection in others that we don't demand in ourselves. And that's not what Elijah was doing at all.
Well, and since we're running in the context, think about 1 Kings chapter 20, when after all this talk about Elijah's been dominating the scene since chapter 17. The world's wickedest king does his most wicked deed, and some prophet that we don't even have his name anymore speaks to Ahab, and Ahab repents, and God forgives him of his sin and extends his life and extends the life of his family. Elijah didn't pull that off. And I don't know if that was some kind of failing on Elijah's part. I don't think we're supposed to understand that. I think the point is, again, circling back to the underdog thing, sometimes it's somebody you've never heard of and never will hear of again, saying the right thing at the right time to the right person and doing something remarkable. Great things can happen if we allow God to work through us.
Amen. Well, and there's also the cumulative effect that, I mean, there's no telling. how much of what Elijah had said to Ahab was still resonating with him. I mean, it's still, exactly what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, I planted and Apollos watered and God gave the increase. And so we need to realize that when we're preaching, we want to preach, or when we're teaching, if we're just living our daily lives and trying to evangelize, that what we're trying to do is present the word of God in a way that it can find purchase in the heart of the individual.
There's nothing wrong with hard preaching, so to say, but there's everything wrong with trying to defeat our enemies rather than trying to preach the gospel and to convert them to Christ. And a lot of times we can kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, I did this thing. And really that patting ourselves on the back was the whole point, right? Like we can go out and say, hey, I've tilted at this windmill and pretended that it was some great feat.
Mm-hmm. Winning debates is not the same thing as winning souls.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we kind of hearken back to those debate days, that we want to see those days of the passionate, fiery exchanges. And I understand there are places for those type of things, but how many people are actually converted in the middle of those kinds of discussions?
Well, and even if I don't know if y'all read many of those old debates. I've only read a few. A lot of the ones that have been like really highly recommended to me. And I read through and I say, this is at times extraordinarily faulty logic that is based on winning a rhetorical strategy than actually being honest with the scriptures. And here we have, and that, then you have all of a sudden given up truth to win an argument. And that's not good.
If it takes that kind of...
I've noticed that too, that a lot of times we'll get away in debates with what we won't get away with in sermons. Or hopefully we're not getting away with in sermons.
You've been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.